Hey everybody, how are you doing tonight? I am riding solo, and so I am Dr. Carolyn George with Vita Integrative Medicine, and my sidekick, Leslie Harrington, is not able to be with us tonight. So we send out hellos to her wherever she is. So I'm hopeful that we'll get some good interactions between people so that you can send in questions to me that I can go ahead and answer, because I don't have somebody to kind of banter back and forth with. So tonight we are going to be talking about sunlight and vitamin D. And so I really want to make sure, I'm just got to do something here to make sure everybody can see me. I want, if everybody can, if they have any questions about the benefits of vitamin D, the benefits of sunlight, then please shoot me some questions. Hello, Brian. Hi, Marianne. Thank you guys for joining. I always love to see my posse there supporting and spreading the news of what's good for your health. So just as a side note, feel free to share with your Facebook friends. You can post under YouTube. We have all different ways of getting this word out. So when this is over, we'll release it, and by tomorrow it will be on YouTube, so that if you have anybody that has these kinds of questions, they can watch and also send us questions at the same time. Okay, so what we're going to dive in today is the connection between vitamin D and the sun. So a lot of you already know vitamin D is very important for bone health. But what a lot of you may not know is that it's not just for bones, not just for that one simple thing, but it really is important for the full body health. We used to think of this as a vitamin, and that's where it got its name, vitamin D, or cholecalciferol. But we actually understand now it's been relabeled as a pre-pro hormone. So pre-pro means that it's the beginning of a hormone. It has to be changed a little bit to become a hormone, but your vitamin D gives us the ring structure to your cholesterol, and cholesterol, which has got a very bad rap, but it's actually a good thing, is the precursor to your sex hormones, to testosterone and estrogen and progesterone, as well as your cortisol. So there's a whole continuum of importance to this. So you've got to have plenty of vitamin D to be able to make the sex hormones, to be able to make your cortisol so you can manage your stress and live happily and operate at that fight or flight mode that most of us do most times of the day. So really, really, really important. We have been really discovering how important this is in the last few years, although there were some wise doctors that kind of understood back in the 40s and 50s that this was really important. So they started to do some studies, but there really haven't been a lot done until the 70s, when we could actually measure the amount of that hydroxy. It's called 25-hydroxy vitamin D. That's the test your doctor should order, 25-hydroxy, or OH, vitamin D3. So until the 70s, we didn't have a way of measuring this. So it wasn't until after the 70s that we found out a little bit about the importance of it. So Cheryl is asking, is there a difference in D and D3? Yes, there is. And Brian asks, is it possible to take too much vitamin D? And yes, and I'm gonna go into both of those awesome questions. Thank you guys. So to take a step back, vitamin D, plain vitamin D, is again that pre-pro hormone, but there is a D2, and then there's a D3. So D2 actually comes to us in some foods, like mushrooms has D2, but it really is more underneath our skin. It's the inactive version. And then D3 is the more activated version, and then that gets activated further. So there's a whole bunch of different steps. So D2 is less active, D3 is a little bit more, and then that 125, so 1,25 hydroxy D3 is the most active, but it's also the shortest lasting. So we don't generally measure the 125 because it only stays in our blood for about 15 hours. So the way we usually measure it is 25, and sometimes there'll be reasons to measure both the 25 and the 125 hydroxy vitamin D3. So why does it matter? Because we want to make sure that you've got the most active version, and in some people, genetically, they don't activate that vitamin D2 into vitamin D3 very easily. And in other people, you can have vitamin D receptors that are less efficient, less effective at grasping onto the vitamin D. So sometimes it's best to just use the vitamin D3 because you're going to have get the best blood levels with that. And then, of course, you have to ask, well, what does it matter about blood levels? But we'll get to that. So going way back, evolutionary speaking, okay, when we lived in the African savanna, we were all dark-skinned, we were equatorial, we got lots of D, our skin produced melanin that helped to make our skin darker, to protect us from the effects of the sunlight, because too much sunlight, too much of that UVA and UVB is damaging to our skin, damaging to our cells. It can change our DNA, it can be precancerous, it can cause DNA shifts that can lead to cancer, and of course skin cancer. So back on that African safari or savanna, we needed dark skin. But then a group left and went into the northern climates. And actually, when you speak to people that study evolutionary biology, they say that we actually became light-skinned pretty fast. So they feel that there must have been a very big evolutionary push for us to become lighter skinned. And one of the theories is that because now we were getting sun less of the day and it's less intense, and there's months of the year where we don't get any sunlight or very little, and when we do, we're all covered up in our scarves and our toques and things like that, which you guys are up north are starting to get into now. So even though there might be sun, we weren't exposing our skin to it, and so we weren't getting the benefits. So although, trust me, 100,000 years ago or whenever that population shift was, they weren't wearing toques and scarves, but they were wearing furs and things like this that they were covering up, so they weren't getting the benefits of any sun that there might be out there. So our skin got lighter and lighter to allow more of that vitamin D to get in, is the theory. So when the vitamin D comes to us, it has to come through our skin, so arms, legs, back, face, it doesn't matter, but it has to get underneath into our subcutaneous tissue, which is where that activation starts. And not that it really matters for most of us, but the UVB seems to be the rays that really activate that vitamin D and make it into D3. They did some studies where they took people and they gave them, they'd measured their vitamin D, and then they put them in a UV, like a suntanning situation, where within little pods where you get the fake sun, and they gave them just UVB, and they gave them UVA. So one group UVB, one group UVA, and they found it was only the group that had the UVB that raised their vitamin D. So from that, they figured, okay, it's UVB that does it. So now we know a little bit about that. So all these studies have to be done in steps so that you can see, first off, does the sun actually make vitamin D? Okay, yes, it does. So then they did some population studies and looked to see what things people with low vitamin D had more commonly than people with high vitamin D. Now, these are studies of association, okay? That means that when we see this often comes hand in hand, but it doesn't mean that X causes Y. It just means that we see them kind of together. Then you have to do studies where you look at how you can prove that X causes Y, and so that gets more complicated, and that's usually your double-blind, placebo-controlled types of studies. And so we're going to get to some of those. So then the scientists looked to see, okay, what's happening with the populations. And so they found that populations that had very low vitamin D, and these are generally groups of people that are above the equator, so in the temperate zones, north and south, they have higher risks of cancer, they have higher risks of heart disease, they have higher risks of colon cancer. And so it's not just by virtue of being north, because they of course look at that, but it's by virtue of having the lower vitamin D. They found that that correlated well with increased risks. And again, that doesn't mean that a low vitamin D is going to cause that, or the reverse, that a high vitamin D is going to prevent that. So they did these population studies that made them way more interested about what could be going on with the vitamin D and how is that involved, because at that point we really just thought it was all about the bones, right? So in the bones, if you have low vitamin D, you, as a child, you get something called rickets, which means your bones are kind of malformed and you won't grow bones properly, kind of they'll loop out. And if you're an adult and develop low vitamin D, you can get osteomalacia, which is soft bones, so they kind of break easily, they're just not strong bones. So that's what we've always traditionally thought of for low vitamin D. But as this research started to come in, it started to suggest that there was a relationship. And then they did more research to look to see that this vitamin D was actually a prohormone, not just a vitamin, which kind of puts it up higher in the kind of physiology. If you had kind of a social hierarchy of nutrients in the body, the prohormones are going to be more important than a vitamin, although they all have their importance. So that's kind of some of the research that's gone in behind vitamin D. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more in a minute about the research, but I don't want to bore you with all the research. So Cheryl had asked about the difference between D and D3, so we talked about that. And then Brian asked, is it possible to take too much vitamin D? And yes, it is. But with a big proviso, it's pretty hard to get your vitamin D up that high. There is nobody that they have studied who from the environment, from the sun, has ever had too high a vitamin D. Your body has kind of a feedback process that you build up, you know, the suntan, you get darker skin, so that protects you against getting too much. So from the sun, no, you're not going to get too much. Now, can you get it from foods? Yes, you can. There are a few foods that have vitamin D in them, but not a lot. So when you're thinking foods, you are talking about things like your really fatty fish, like herring and sardines, and even salmon actually have pretty good amounts. Swordfish would have very good amounts of vitamin D in it. You can get some vitamin D from mushrooms. I mentioned that before. That's D2 though, not D3. We have added it to milk, so you can get enriched or fortified milk with some D3 in it. That's not a huge amount, but that is a way to get it. And if you listen to any of my podcasts before, my Facebook Lives, you'll know I'm not a huge proponent of drinking milk. So really you're looking at these different kinds of fish. There's a little bit in eggs, in the yolk part of eggs. There's a little smattering around in food, but you're really not going to get enough unless you're out there getting it from the sun or taking it from a supplement. So in supplements, back in the 70s, they were saying that 100 IUs was enough each day. And actually they said that even before they could measure it, which is kind of, you raise the question, you're like, how did they figure out how much if you couldn't really measure it? But we're not going to get into that. Then they went up and said we need about 200 for bone health, IUs, 200 IUs, international units. Then as they did more studies, they said 400. And then more recently, the recommendation through the task force is 600 IUs a day in adults from 17 to about 70. After 70, they feel you need about 800 IUs. But that is an area of great contention, right? So there's two polar camps. One that says don't have too much, it can be a problem for you, and another camp that says no, our recommended daily allowance, or RDA, is way underestimated and we really need much more. That's a whole fight I won't go into, but I will say I do side on the camp that says we need way more than that 600 or 800 IUs a day. And the reason I say this is I see it every day in my office. I get people who come in with very low vitamin D levels, 17, 18, 20, 30. They come in with a variety of symptoms. So you can get headaches from that. You can get bone pain, fibromyalgia, muscle kind of pains. You can have increased cholesterol. You can have high blood pressure. There's a lot of things that we will use vitamin D in addition to other things, not alone, but it's a component of a treatment plan. And that as you address that and you get those levels up, these symptoms dissipate. So is that a big, huge study with 25,000 people in it? No, and we do need those kinds of studies. But in the meantime, it really has, in my view, and actually in many researchers' view, a very low side effect profile. So how high is too high? If you get over 100 nanomoles in your blood, that's considered too high. And really most of the articles that I've read say you really don't get negative side effects until you hit 150. So I try to keep my people between about 50 and 80, somewhere in there, and certainly not at the lower limit of what the normal is. You get your test done by your doctor. The normal will come back between 30 and 100. So I try to stay far away from 30 and pretty far away from 100 and stick it around 50 or 60 is my goal. Some doctors really want to push it higher, even into 80, and there is some potential benefit with kind of turning on some genes at that level. Dr. Perlmutter has done some research and really is a proponent of trying to bring it up into that 80 range, but you have to watch it carefully so that you don't go over. It can take months, if not years, to get somebody from 20 to 50, but then to go from 50 to 100 seems to go a little bit faster. So I watch people pretty closely and just repeat blood tests. So we've got Diana, we've got Ellen now that's joined us, Michelle. Thank you guys for joining, and please pipe in with any questions. So I'm trying to go through some of these questions because you guys are being awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate you throwing in the questions. So vitamin D levels over 100 are too high, to answer Brian's question, but that can be pretty hard to get to, quite honestly. I have only had a smattering of people that ever get that high. I'm watching them as they creep up, and they only get that high if they don't see me for a while, we don't do any blood tests, or they start to take super, super, super high doses, which, some people will take 20, 30, 40,000 IUs a day, and that can boost you up pretty quickly, but then you run the risk of going over too much. So always good to be careful. Hi, Leda. Very good to see you. So some other questions. Can you take vitamin D for life? Absolutely. We have been taking vitamin D since the 70s, and they have studied those side effect profiles, and there does not seem to be any major issue as long as you don't go too high with taking that for life. Does that make a difference to your health, though, is what they're really investigating right now. So I told you before that the population studies showed that people that had a low vitamin D tended to have higher risks of colon cancer, of diabetes, of depression, of heart disease, and several cancers. So then they started to do some studies, and I kind of got some cheat sheets here because I wanted to make sure to give you some of this information accurately. So they did some studies actually looking at high blood pressure, and they looked at the vitamin D supplementation in African Americans with the risk of hypertension. So we know that African Americans have a much higher risk of high blood pressure, and it tends to start at earlier ages. And so one of the hypotheses is that because of their darker skin, especially here in North America, they're not getting as much vitamin D, and that is triggering a whole sequence of events that then lead to their higher blood pressure. So what they did, this was in 2013, so these were people that had normal blood pressure, and they took 250 individuals and gave them 1,000 IUs, which at that time was quite high, or 2,000 IUs a day, or 4,000. So they had those 3 camps that were being treated, and then they had one that had placebo. So 4 groups, one with 1,000, one with 2,000, one with 4,000, and one with placebo. And then they measured that, they gave them that for the 3 months, and then watched their blood pressure. And they found that for every certain increase in vitamin D, that they had a decrease in their blood pressure. So but just the diastolic, that's the bottom number. So that showed that it did impact blood pressure, but they didn't really understand. And now they've kind of worked some the physiology out and think they can kind of understand why that might make a difference. So then they did another study, more people, and looked and measured them what their vitamin D was before, which they didn't do in that 2013 study, and then measured it after and looked at the change in the blood pressure. And long story short, what they find is that people did improve their blood pressure if they started off with a low vitamin D. If they had, the 30, 40, 50 range of vitamin D already, then their blood pressure didn't improve statistically. But if they were already low, then that vitamin D could benefit them. They repeated a similar experiment in Denmark showing kind of the same thing. So then some groups got together and did what they call a meta-analysis, where they take a whole bunch of different studies, and they took 35 different studies involving over 155,000 people that showed that the 25 hydroxyvitamin D, that's the one I told you, that's the one that we measure, resulted in lower blood pressure levels and a reduced risk of high blood pressure. So overall in all of these studies, and there are multiple different kinds of studies, so I can't go over all the details of the studies, but they did find that it did correlate higher level of vitamin D, lower blood pressure, okay? And that was in a very big study, or big group, that's that meta-analysis. So then they studied more recently, and actually this just came out last month, November of 2018, where they did what's called the VITAL study. So they looked at vitamin D and they looked at omega-3s, and so I'm just going to talk about the vitamin D portion of that study. But they looked at a big group of people, I think it was 12,000, almost 13,000 people over 5 years. And they gave them 2,000 IUs each day. And so they had a group that's placebo and a group that got the 2,000. And they were looking at cancer risk and heart risk. So heart attacks, high blood pressure, that type of thing. And what they actually found was that, and they actually, as a side note, they didn't measure people's vitamin D3 at the beginning or throughout the study to see if they got into the normal range. They were just giving them 2,000 IUs every day, placebo or not. People didn't know what they got. And they found over the 5 years that there was not a statistical decrease in the risk of certain cancers. So you'd say, oh, okay, well, too bad. But when they broke it down and they looked at different groups of people, they found that there was not a change in the occurrence of breast, prostate, or colorectal cancer, but a 17% reduction in cancer deaths. So it's not whether you get cancer, but dying from the cancer. So that was a good thing, which became a 25% reduction when you gave them 7 years. Instead of looking at the data after 5 years, you gave them 2 more years. Not necessarily, actually, they weren't even taking the vitamin D those extra 2 years, but cancer takes a long time to kind of come out. It takes a while for us to kind of know what the percentages are. So when we added 2 more years on, that risk reduction became 25%. So that's a little bit more interesting. And the other thing that was particularly interesting was that in African Americans, there was a 23% reduction in cancer risk, even in that 5-year period that they did the test or the study. So if you're African American, that it kind of really behooves you to get that vitamin D in there, because even 2,000 IUs a day, which is lower than many of us in functional medicine will use, is something that can potentially decrease your cancer risk. Now, we don't know why. We still don't have all of that kind of mapped out, but we do know that as that prohormone, it affects your immune system, and your immune system is important for surveillance, for cleaning out your body of the cells that are weak and changed and it could be precancerous. So if your immune system is stronger, then you're going to surveil and clean house better. Right? And again, African Americans likely more because of that darker skin, which impedes the sun from getting in there and making the change underneath the skin. So evolutionary wise, it helped them 100,000 years ago, but when they were in equatorial regions, but now they're all over the world, and northern the United States, they're not getting all that sun, so they've got a bigger block. And I'm going to talk about that too in just a second, about what things block the vitamin D from getting into your skin other than melanin. So that was a really cool study that looked at that cancer risk, so can be helpful. We need more studies, and I think we need higher doses, and I think we probably need to measure, are these people getting to optimal levels, and we need to really figure out what is an optimal level. So is it 2,000 for this person and 5,000 for this? I think we need to personalize it. I don't think we can have blanket statements because there are so many variables. Where do you live? What kind of work do you do? Are you outside? Are you a lifeguard? Are you inside in the office? What's your skin color? What other foods do you eat, right? What are your other hormones doing? We really need to kind of understand that this isn't a one size fits all, is to me the take home from that study, and that we need to really examine it more. When we looked at cardiovascular risk, okay, so that where it was a good benefit, and actually they say that where was it here? Sorry, no, there was no improvement in cardiovascular risk. So supplemental vitamin D did. Sorry, somebody trying to call me right now in the midst of this. When they broke that up into smaller groups and looked at racial groups and locations and diabetes and other cofactors, they didn't really find any big impact from vitamin D on cardiovascular health at that dose, at 2,000 IUs. Okay, so and Michelle's asking, she says, I take 3,000 IUs of vitamin D, that's not too much. Don't know, we have to measure you. You need to get that measured to see what your level is, and then see if you are at a good level. If you're around 50 or 60, then that should be a good dose. But on 3,000, if you are at 90 or 100 or 110, then you want to cut back. I would say most of the patients I have at 300 IUs or 3,000 IUs are nowhere near a good range, an optimal range. So I just would say measure it. That's really the key thing. And you like to use the gummy bears. So I don't have a problem with gummy bears. It's just the sugar that you might get in that. And that's not a huge amount, but you're taking one every day. It just kind of depends. But it's easy to chew. So I got you there. I think there was another question too. I want to just make sure that I answered everybody's questions. And let me just see here. The other thing I wanted to talk about is what things block your vitamin D. So we've talked about melanin, like the darker skin can block it. And actually Diana asked liquid versus veg caps. Some people find that they absorb the liquid better, but it really is individual. So try whatever version you like best, whether it's the capsules or the gummies or the liquid. And if you're not getting there and you're taking pretty high doses, then switch to another formulation. And of course, as with all supplements, you want it to be certified. You want to have a certificate of good manufacturing, a CGMP, and you want a certificate of analysis, because there's a lot of garbage out there. So you want somebody that has taken the time to have a third party come and assess and measure how much vitamin D you've got in there and make sure it's within 5% of what they say, and that there's no filler and there's no other added products that are not good for you. Okay, so whatever, if you're finding your vitamin D is not getting your level up, then first thing you want to think about is the quality. And then the second thing you want to think about is it a capsule and I'm not digesting the capsule well, then I need to take it as a liquid. Vitamin D is also fat soluble. So it's good if you take it with a fat, some olives, some nut butters, some coconut, whatever kind of fat you like to enjoy. Of course, the healthy fat, not the bad fats. Don't have it with a rack of ribs or something like that. So doing it with the fat can be helpful. At nighttime, you just have maybe a little bit of almond butter with something, and then you take your vitamin D. So before we go, I do want to talk to you about the things that block. So darker skin tone means it's harder for it to get through underneath the skin into the epidermis. Sunscreen blocks it completely, okay? And that's the thing that the dermatologists love, because they're thinking about the skin cancer, which you also get from that same UVA and UVB. So they're very concerned about preventing the sun damage and the skin cancers. But that sunscreen also stops that vitamin D from getting to you. So trying to find a balance, right, is always key. Windows block UVB. So if you're in your car, if you're in your office, if you're in any place behind glass, you are not getting any UVB. Okay, you're not getting the rays that will give you the vitamin D. And some recent studies, small, we need to repeat them, but they show that if you go to the beach and you're out there and you're sun tanning and you're soaking up all that sun, okay, so my suggestion, by the way, is do that for about 20-30 minutes and then put the sunscreen on so you get your dose of vitamin D for the day, and then lather up. And typically always do your face and the tops of your ears and the back of your neck, because they tend to get a lot of sun. But if you're doing your chest, your arms, your legs, your back, then 20-30 minutes without a sunscreen, and then put it on and reapply so you don't get burnt. I do agree with my colleagues in dermatology that you don't want to get burnt. That is not a good thing. That really damages a lot of skin. But what these little studies are showing is that change is happening under the epidermis. We leave the beach, we go home, we shower, and we slough off that layer of skin. So showering right after the beach might be aesthetically good for us, right? We don't smell or anything, but it may be taking away some of the vitamin D that we just made. So watch out for other studies that can look at that. But if you're having a hard time getting your D up and you're out there at the beach all the time, but going right back and showering like mad and scrubbing it all your sunscreen and sand and everything off, just know that might be something that's affecting you. Okay? So that is kind of the scoop on vitamin D. Please ask your practitioners to measure it. It is now becoming much more widely accepted. And in fact, most psychiatrists that see patients that I see have measured their vitamin D. And I think that is awesome, because they understand just how important that is to your mood. So vitamin D really impacts so many important things, not only, like I said, headaches and pain and potentially cancer risk and blood pressure, but also mood. So vitamin D, good for more than just bones. Please get it through the sun, get it through your supplements, enjoy the foods that have in it, but don't depend on those for your vitamin D, and get it measured so you know what your level is. And watch for all the medical studies to continue to provide us with more information on the benefits or lack thereof of vitamin D and different issues. Okay, so if anybody has any questions, I'm out of time, but just send me a text or on the Facebook Live, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. And please feel free to share our little Facebook Live segment with anybody that you think might be interested. Next week, I will be talking about the flu and ways to help to prevent you from picking it up, because 'tis the season for picking up flu and other upper respiratory types of illnesses. So tune in next week for how to stay healthy. And until then, have a fabulous week and enjoy whatever you're doing in this happy holiday season. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later.